Jason, what's going on, man? Welcome back to the Pilot podcast. This is the second video in our series of pretty much how to become a pilot. We did how to become a student pilot in the previous episode. So if you're watching just the private pilot one and maybe you're not a private pilot, you should probably go back and watch the student pilot one because it's a lot of good info on how to choose a flight school, what to look for in a flight instructor, resources you can do, and ways you can help save yourself money, even though it might sound counterintuitive because you'll be spending more money initially, but it will save you money in the long run. But today is all about private pilot. So we're going to assume that you have picked a flight school, you kind of have an instructor, maybe you're getting ready to meet with your instructor, or you're in the training process right now. So we're going to talk about what your mindset should be. We're going to talk about how you can be the most successful private pilot possible. And yeah, just go from there. So if you want to kick it off now, or if you want me to start asking questions, we can just go.
Yeah, no, I mean, there is something I would like to say because I think that there's a mindset that's important for private pilots, or for really for any pilots. Trying to think of how to lead into this. Sometimes it comes up when people ask me how much money is this going to cost me to become a private pilot. And my first thought after my experience is trying to shift them out of the idea that it's some fixed amount of money and then it's going to be over. More trying to help people understand that if you're going to take this on, this is something that you will continually invest in. So I think as far as the money goes, it's better to think about it in terms of how much could I afford to spend every month? You know, if I adopt this habit of flying, then can I afford to spend $500 a month on it in perpetuity, or $1,000 a month on it in perpetuity? And the reason I say that is because I think that the mindset shift that would be beneficial for most folks is to think about the flying skills a little bit like athletics. Like I happen to be a fight fan. I love watching boxing and other fights. And so let's just use that as an analogy.
At all.
You wouldn't? Yeah. I'm a big MMA fan. Anyway.
Interesting.
Yeah. But in that analogy, a guy like Mike Tyson has all the knowledge and all the skills, or pick any boxer, Tyson Fury, doesn't matter, has all the knowledge and all the skills that he needs to go execute a fight. But if he's not continually training, like if he just sits on the sofa and eats potato chips for 7 months, he can't just jump into the ring, right? An athlete has to maintain a certain level of athletic fitness, a certain level of athletic proficiency, a certain level of limberness and all that sort of stuff. So having the skills and the knowledge is one part. But then continuing to keep those skills and knowledge sharp and healthy is the second part. And I think flying is very, very much like that, right? So just because you got your certificate 12 months ago and your flight review is not for another 12 months doesn't mean you can stop training, right? It doesn't mean you can stop getting ready for the quote fight, because in this analogy, the flight is the fight. Yeah. You know, like every time you get in the plane and you go to execute the mission, that's the fight you need to be ready for. And you have to be sharp and having the knowledge. It's not like you get it and it's done.
Yep. Yeah. When I was doing my training, I always had the analogy that like every flight is my game essentially, you know, and to win the game is to land safely, not bust any regulations and not come home crying because you're not really crying, but just so upset with yourself that you just suck so bad, you know? Yeah. So if you can look at it like that, I think it's a very healthy way and a good way to look at it, because it is kind of a competition within yourself to have the best flight you can possibly have, to be the safest you can be. And some days the safest option is being like, hey, you know what? You follow the I'm safe checklist and you just don't feel comfortable flying. We briefly touched on that before in the last episode of the importance of saying no. And we'll get into that further down, especially when you become a professional pilot. But yeah, I think that's very important to understand that it's not just the initial 40K or 10K. I mean, depending on where you're going for school, obviously you're not going to spend 40K on your private. I would hope not, at least. That would be highway robbery. But it's very important to understand that this is going to be more of an investment than just that initial kind of sticker cost of the 9K, 10K that you're going to be paying for your private pilot license.
Yeah, 100% too. And I think we can disconnect it from money. I mean, I can, and I'm happy to do that, but we can talk about all sorts of strategies that'll save people money. I mean, I feel like if, we could sit down and talk the rest of this conversation about ways folks can save thousands of dollars in training, but it has nothing to do with not training, right? Like, I mean, what am I trying to say? You can continue to stay in training, so to speak, or keep yourself sharp or keep yourself polished without spending a dime. The important part for me early on is to get folks to sort of adopt that mindset that this is not something I do and put down, but this is a lifestyle I've adopted. And I'm going to maintain this lifestyle for as long as I fly airplanes because the flight is the fight and I have to be ready for that.
Yeah. Well, since you
But,
mentioned it
things
already,
like,
okay, keep going.
sorry, but things like in terms of when it comes to saving money, things like dry
Hmm.
time or like the way you're debriefing the lessons. And if folks don't know what dry time is, that's like when you go to the airplane and you just sit in it. You go to your flight school, even when you don't have a lesson scheduled, and you say, "Hey, is there any airplane on the ramp that's not being used for the next hour? Can I just sit in it?" And run checklists and run flows and look over systems if you need to. Like that type of engagement doesn't cost
Yeah.
anything, but it takes a certain mindset to want to go down and do that or know that you have to.
Yeah, but don't do that in the summertime in North Carolina because it'll be 100 degrees and you'll die because there's no air conditioning at a 172 on the ramp. But
Yeah, that's right. You're probably not in danger of that too much there.
yeah,
Um,
so if you're in California, where Jason is, then yeah, go do that. But no, that's a good
yeah,
option. Oh wow, excuse me. Another good
yeah,
option is if you have Flight Simulator, right? They have 172s on. It's very intuitive, and how you start an airplane is the same way you're going to start it on Flight Simulator. So that's another good option too. I know my buddy who flies for NetJets. He upgraded, and now he's flying the Bombardier Challenger 650. And before he went out, he got all his flows, and he bought the 650 upgrade for it, or maybe they had it. I think I can't remember exactly, but he would just go through his flows, start the engine, and do everything on the simulator, and that prepared him for his training. And he said it helped out a lot. So that's another great
yeah,
option as well.
yeah. It is, and that's a good segue too, because the danger with simulators that I see is that folks really at this level shouldn't be flying them exactly.
Hmm.
Like I can usually tell with a trip or two around the pattern if my students have been using flight simulators because there are very
Yeah.
specific mistakes they'll make.
Oh, like
It's
what?
like connecting airspeed to like
Uh,
so one really obvious mistake is they tend to drive at the aiming point without being aware of the increasing airspeed and the sound of the slipstream and
yeah.
like pilots that I've trained would intuitively put the nose down and pull the power back,
Yeah.
because you could tell that you're accelerating, right? Like you can
Right.
feel acceleration in an airplane, but somebody who's been using a simulator a lot will just be fixated on that aiming point, pointing at it, sort of tuning out all of those acceleration cues because they're just not
Yeah.
used to them. Stuff like that. Which isn't to say the simulators aren't tremendously valuable, but that's why this is a great segue because it gets me to the next point, which is maybe my specific. I mean, I have to be full disclosure here, I've spent the better part of the last 20 years trying to make the following argument to the industry. So this is sort of my little soapbox that I stand up on. But I think kind of standardizing your flying is extremely important. And we see it all over the professional world, right? Like,
Hmm.
being a professional pilot, that standardization is the cornerstone of safety. Really, like if we didn't have standard operations or standard operating procedures among professional pilots, I mean, I just can't imagine that world. Honestly, we haven't been in that world since like 1915.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I mean, like it's been a long time. But in GA, in general aviation, a lot of flight instructors don't know that or don't consider it
Yeah.
or don't give it to the students early on. And so for those that have never heard it, right, Justin, the law of primacy is huge. It's a learning law that says the first way you learn it is the way you're going to tend to do it forever. And for that reason, I lose more. Like with my students, I spend almost more time up front teaching them how to standardize the operation than I do teaching them the specifics of flying. I
Hmm.
have no doubt they're going to learn how to land or learn how to take off or any of those things, but will they be operating the airplane with the right aeronautical mindset is what's more important to me than that.
What do you think about implementing kind of flows and triggers for someone that's a private pilot or someone that is just starting out? Because obviously, airlines, corporate, a lot of them operate with flows and triggers. And if you're going down that
Yep.
route, it's best to kind of implement that at an earlier stage. just so they're used to it, and it helps with their training. And it's kind of like how now you're getting a Garmin G1000 or some kind of fancy Garmin equipment, and then you're going to have Garmin your whole career, right? You can work up all the way to an FMS. So it's kind of like the same standard. So if you can start training at an early stage with how they do it in the airlines, then it can help you out for that. Are you a proponent for flows and triggers at a private pilot lesson and private pilot stage?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I mean, that's exactly the standardization that I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And you
Okay.
know, if anybody wanted to know exactly what I think about this, it's all built into our ground school app, right? On the flight side, there's a whole chapter on standard operating procedures, and it's really the same thing that I would teach anybody. But to answer your question, like, what do I think of them? Like, there's three little warnings I just want to throw out there for people. All right. And for anyone that doesn't know what it is, a flow or a trigger, like a flow is simply a pattern around the cockpit. It's a way that
Mm-hmm.
you move your eyes to help remember items that you're going to execute at first anyway from memory. The airlines have a more evolved trigger concept. I don't use the trigger so much as the flow, but the idea that some event would trigger some course of action that you've like rehearsed ahead of time, right? Is the trigger idea.
Mm-hmm.
So what do I think of those? First of all, I think the reason we do them, if anyone doesn't know, is that in a single pilot environment, redundancy is incredibly difficult to come by. And I try to teach pilots that we fly by the scientific method, right? Like everything's a hypothesis until we can prove it's true via some separate source. And we try to have that sort of cross check and redundancy. And it's quite an art in a single pilot world. And the people that are really, really good at it, maybe like some of the folks like in your first jobs, right? Weren't you flying single pilot cargo? And so, yeah, like that world is like the most advanced in terms of single pilot procedures and operations. You know, professional companies that have pilots flying around by themselves is the world we want to look at. And so because there's one pilot, there's one brain, there is no built-in redundancy, there's no pilot monitoring, there's no co-pilot, it's just you. And that's the world we find ourselves in GA. We have to come up with these ways of guessing at something first and then cross-checking it via some written list, right? And that's a very important process. That process alone is a great example of what I'm talking about, because most general aviation pilots will think this is how you do a checklist. You just pick up a piece of paper and read a list. And that's not really a check of anything when there's only one person doing it. So we have to guess. Let's say, okay, we'll do a flow around the cockpit and say, is there anything I need to do? Do I need to do, oh, the mixture goes rich. Is there anything else? I can't think of anything. And then we pick up a list and say, oh, look at that. I missed the lights, great. There's a checklist. Yep. So yeah, that process is really important. So that's why we do it. I would keep your flow checks really simple. So I think in the airline world, they get kind of diverse sometimes because it's a much more complicated cockpit environment. There's a lot more time to train and all that sort of stuff. So you'll have a flow for this and a flow for that. And the trigger for this flow goes this way. And the flow, the T flow and the Y flow and the Z flow. I think in GA, just dump all that. It's one flow. That's it. And just keep it simple, stupid, that KISS principle.
For sure.
And then don't blow off the checklist. Those are my big warnings. So in my experience, if, when I convince pilots that this is advantageous to them to learn this and to operate the airplane this way, they'll do the flows. And then what tends to happen over time is they will stop checking it. They'll stop picking up the checklist. They'll just do the flow, right? And just remember, you're a single pilot operator. We are intentionally dividing this into a two-part process to build in redundancy. It's just up to you to do both sides.
Yeah.
And in an unregulated environment, that's the biggest challenge there, is that no one's watching. No, you're not going to get fired if you don't pick up the checklist. And that
you could die though.
Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, that doesn't motivate a lot of people.
When we go to, or when you look at people that are private pilots or in the private pilot training process, there's a lot of ups and downs. Have you kind of narrowed it down to like, all right, 7 hour slug. Like this is where someone starts to struggle. You know, the first 7 hours are great. They're excited to be there. Then we see some regression. Have you seen kind of like, have you been able to scientifically, not really necessarily prove it, but just get an idea of where the highs and lows can happen? I know it's tailored for each individual pilot. Other people have different highs and lows, but just generally speaking, can you kind of expect when someone, and you can expect to see a certain, a lull in performance or training?
Yeah, I mean, there are times like that. The most obvious ones in my mind actually happen in the instrument rating. Like,
Mm-hmm.
for example, everybody's landings start to suck. So I all like you will always, double eyes out there will testify to this. At some point in instrument training, you will always hear the student complain about the landing. You're only
Yeah.
doing one on every flight. You know, they just kind of get bad. That's why I always say get your tail wheel after your instrument and just bring it all full circle. But for the
Yeah.
private, it's more about patterns, right? Like, so it's the the learning plateaus or the barriers to, you know, you'll be moving fast, moving fast, moving fast, then all of a sudden you just can't get something. You're just like stuck on something, you know? That will vary. So some people get stuck on stalls and some people get stuck on landings and some people get stuck on S turns across a road or whatever it is. But I think the thing that's really important to notice, or the thing that I've learned to notice very quickly, is when you're at that place, so that you're not just banging your head on the wall, and then what to do about it. So if you're going through private training and you arrive at some phase of the training that is giving you a lot of problems, let's just say landings, because that is a really common one.
Mm-hmm.
You go out once, just, you know, not happening. You go out again, it's not happening. You know, that third time is the last time I would try that before I moved on. So if you hit that wall and whatever it is just ain't happening, you need to move off of it for a minute. And I don't know what really made me aware of this, but I'm also a musician, so maybe other musicians will understand this. But like, there are times when you're trying to play a very hard piece of music, like on the guitar or something, and you'll stay up late, 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 working on it, right, and you just can't get it, and you're so frustrated, your fingers hurt, and you just can't do it. You throw the guitar aside and you go to bed. You wake up in the morning, you pick up the guitar, and it's like first thing out of your fingers, just
Yeah.
perfect, right? What happened? Excuse me. What happened
I charge my TV. Hang on a
in
second. Keep talking.
that's right. What
I
happened
gotta
in the
charge my TV. Keep
interim?
talking.
You know,
Sorry.
you took your eye off the ball for a second, and it came right. And so the same thing with flying. Like if you're working on landings and you're banging your head on a wall, you're banging your head on a wall, you're banging your head on a wall. Get out of it and go do something else. Go to an airport and work on simulated engine failures. Work on emergency descents. Work on something, anything other than landing. And it could be that when you come back and put on that landing head again, all of a sudden the skills are there. So that's an important thing to, you know, to make sure that you don't continue to bang your head on the wall when you're not getting it, that you shift your focus and go do something else. But also working with other instructors, I think, is, just to throw it out there, totally common,
Yeah.
should not be a problem. The first time I learned how to land crosswinds, my instructor was not present. Lisa was absent that day. It was super windy, and I remember sitting at the airport, and there's some guy behind the desk, yeah, Kim DeLongchamps, and I was like, "Hey, you want to go fly and show me some crosswinds?" And he's like, "Really, today?" You know, and I said, "Sure." So we went up, and boom, that's when I got the crosswinds. So if I'm with a student and we're hitting that wall, often I'll send them with a
Yeah.
colleague. Perfect time for a phase check. You know, go fly with Jeff and see what he thinks.
Yeah.
And
Well, I mean, I think we've kind of talked about this before too. Is some instructors are better at other things, right? Like maybe you're not. This isn't. I'm just using you as an example. But maybe you're not as good as portraying information about crosswinds, or maybe the way you explain it just isn't working for your
yeah,
student. So if you have a
right.
friend that's like, "Hey," like you said, go up with Jeff. Like go up with Jeff. Jeff will teach you what I can't teach you,
Yeah,
and it'll be good. And I think that's healthy and a good instructor-student relationship for the instructor to recognize this as well. And what's hard for the instructor is that comes from experience. When a lot of
yeah,
times, if you're a new student, you might be getting the new instructor, so you're kind of
yeah,
just learning and you're kind of figuring that out as you go.
yeah, yeah. It's true. It is true. But most instructors, well, all instructors should not have ego about that, and most
Yeah,
don't. And if you know, just
most
if there are any instructors hearing this, I find that process, even though sometimes a little bit uncomfortable, is really what keeps me at the top of my game. I mean,
really.
I sort of count on it. It's like
Yeah,
peer review, you know, like if you're an
yeah,
author and you're not getting peer reviewed, then sort of what good is your work? Like if none of your
Oh,
colleagues say that you're good, right? And
yeah.
that's what phase checks are, is a chance for you to get better.
Absolutely. And then a lot of things that I hear with student pilots or private pilots is, man, my instructor is not working out, or I just don't really like this flight school. Do you think there's a certain amount of time that you need to dedicate to give them a chance? Because, like we talked about, maybe it's you, honestly. It could possibly be something where you just as simple as you need to look in the mirror and be like, am I just being not willing to learn? Am I not being cooperative? Is this just something that's a really hard subject? Do I need to reach out for other resources? Or is it to the point where maybe this flight school and my instructor just have a personality clash and I need to go somewhere else? Do you think
Yeah.
there's a certain point or a certain amount of time you need to put in for an instructor or for a flight school before you look for a different choice?
Not a certain amount of time. I will just say that, you've uncovered one of the most common concerns, right? So I think every
Mm,
private pilot listening to this can relate to the feeling of, is my instructor really the good one he's talking about? Like, did I get the right person? Is that who I have? I mean, the
yeah,
bottom line is, when you get into aviation, you don't know up from down. I mean, someone comes in, and that's a huge challenge, and you have this
yeah,
emotional connection with your flight instructor because you're doing this thing that, it's a pretty like intimate exercise, to be honest.
hmm,
Teaching somebody how to fly, just two of you in the airplane, and so you're investing in this instructor, and you're giving them your trust and your time and all this sort of stuff, and you don't want to believe that they're not the best one out there, but you really don't know, and so you're kind of left in that world of doubt. And that's why I just encourage people to try. I mean, like, if my student said to me, like, hey, I don't know how they would bring it to me, but if they had the guts to bring it to me, like, hey, I'm just totally not sure if this is the right fit. Like, I have no idea if you're good or bad. And I saw the school down the street. I'm going to go take a flight with Sally on Saturday and just see what I think. I'd be like, go for it. You know what I mean? Like, it's not it does, there should be no ego in that. And I would encourage that person to go early, get it over with. Like, if you'd rather fly with Sally and you think that's a better fit, let's just do it now so we can both move on. Or go to
yeah.
Sally, see if you learn something, tell me what she
You're like,
says,
let me
or
call
go to,
Sally right now for you. I have her on speed dial.
well, sometimes I do that, but I've definitely had a student. There's one instrument student that comes to mind where, I have a fairly rigorous program. I'm going to demand a lot of my students. I use that
Yeah,
athletic analogy, and I don't want you to be ranked number fifth. I want you to be the heavyweight champ. And that's like, I'm
yeah,
there to be your trainer, to take you to the number one position. And I don't care about the other guys. If you tell me
yeah,
that number 10 doesn't do all this, it's like, well, that's why he's number 10. You know what I mean? Like, we're going for number
yeah,
one. So I had a student say to me, like, this is just too hard. He's like, this is what you're asking me to do is too hard. And by the way, in the back, I totally relate to that, because I said the exact same thing to my mentor, Richard. I said, this
yeah.
is too hard. Nobody can do this. You know what Richard said to me? Richard says, no, I said to him, I said, this is too hard, Richard. You couldn't even do this. And he turns to me and he goes, I don't have to do this. You have to do this. Which is a great answer. But anyway, the student fires me. So he says to me, I'm not going to do the thing you're asking me to do. I'm not going to pick up the checklist after every flow check. And I said, then you're not going to do my program. You should find another flight instructor. No hard feelings, but like, you're either going to fly with me the way I want you to fly, or we're not going to fly together. And he said, good day. And he walked out of the office and did not fly with me anymore, for about 2.5 months. And then I got a call from him saying, hey, listen, I've been reconsidering. I've been spending the last 2.5 months flying with Danielle, and I just don't think she's teaching me well. Like, I just don't have the feeling that I'm getting like great training. I think I'd like to come back and try again. And sure enough, I got this guy his instrument rating, and it's no ego, no
Yeah,
hard feelings. It's just, here's the bar that we've set, and
yeah,
you know, go try somebody else if you want. Maybe we aren't a good fit. Some people don't give 2 cents about excellence, and that person is not a good fit for me.
yeah,
Right? Some people want the cheapest ground school course. They want the fastest thing. How can I get a private certificate for $2,500 and ace my written on the first try? And I don't care if I learned anything, is not a student for me.
yeah.
Somebody that says, I
I would
want to
agree. I
be
mean,
Bob
those are,
Hoover, that's a student for me.
yeah, I
I
mean,
want to be the best pilot ever.
so you can have a private pilot doing rolls and hold sweet
Well,
tea like this.
it's just
I'm
the
kidding. I'm
mindset that
kidding.
we're going to like
Yeah,
strive for excellence. Like, we don't even
yeah.
have to get there, but it's like, um, when it comes to
No, I
flow
totally get
checks,
what you're
and
saying.
Yeah,
Mm,
and when it comes to flow checks and checklists, I tell my students, if you're trying for 100%, if you're committed to getting to 100%, you're going to end up at like 65 or 70, which
yeah.
is great. But if you don't try for 100%, you're going to be down in the 5 to 10% range, right? And it's the same with excellence. Like, you don't ever have to get there, but if you're not striving for it, you're going to end up doing pretty dangerous things in an airplane.
Well, you're never gonna have a perfect flight. There's always gonna be something that you could have done better and you should have done
Right.
better. When we played football, it was always the rule: the eye in the sky never lies. And they also say it's never as good as you thought it was, and it's never as bad as you thought it was. So you throw four touchdowns, good best game ever. You go back and watch film, you're like, well, you could have had six touchdowns and you should not have thrown an interception. And then if you have four interceptions and you mess up, it's like, well, here's a really good play that you made and you built off this and you actually improved your game. So it wasn't as bad as you thought it was because you learned something from it. And that's how
Wow.
flying is too. Whether you record stuff, I mean, we're not going to get into recording or not recording, but that's how flying is. If you have a bad day, just remember it's never as bad as you thought. You did make good decisions, and everything is a learning experience. You can take it, you can learn from it, and you can improve your flight. But I think it's important, like you said, to always strive to have the perfect flight, but understand that you're not going to do it. So don't beat yourself up when you call for a checklist late, or you do something that you just don't normally do, or you can't land, or the crosswind's getting you, or your patterns are all jacked up because you're not accounting for the crosswind and all that kind of stuff. Like, it's going to come.
Yep.
Just learn from it and figure it out. Take a deep breath. Maybe take a day off, too. Like, sometimes
Yeah.
a day off is a good thing to do when you're a private pilot, and just go to the beach, go to the mountains, go for a run. I don't know, play video games, whatever you do for fun.
Yeah, yeah, that's that, take your eye off of it, come back and it'll be
Yeah.
there kind of effect. Is the eye in the sky the camera? Is that what you're saying? Like the
Yeah.
filming the
So it's
football
all
game?
the bits of the film. Yeah. Yep.
Oh man, it's too bad you're not a CFI, by the way, because that experience of yours being, such a high level athlete, uh, I just there's like a wealth that's like a wealth of knowledge that you could, offer
Yeah.
to
Probably.
pilots. Really, yeah. There's so much there. Like, even as you were talking, I was thinking on the micro level. One of the things people will notice when they go into our app is that landings are divided into 5 phases, right? So there's the approach, the round out, the flare, the touchdown, and the rollout. And it's for the reason you're describing. A landing wasn't good or bad. A landing had 5 phases. Like, the approach might have been amazing. The round out was perfect. The flare was perfect. Little sideways on the touchdown, so that sucked. And you dropped the nose too much on the rollout, right? But there's
Yeah.
nothing's ever perfect, and you can look at it
No,
in these granular ways.
absolutely. And when we're talking about landings here, um, what's something for me? I was always told, look down the runway, look down the runway, look down the runway. And I could never just like compute that in my brain. I was like, I am looking down the runway, but I
Yeah,
couldn't look down the runway and kind of interpret the information I was seeing to tell myself what I needed to do until it eventually clicked. But
yeah,
what are
yeah,
some recommendations you have for better landings? And it's helpful that you break it down into 5 sets because, like you said, a good landing starts back with a stabilized approach and continues in with speed, with
yeah.
taking in crosswind corrections and everything from there. So a good landing isn't just touching down and laying the butter. A good landing is preparing yourself for that moment.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's a huge one. So if I mean, that's not to be uh, given short shrift, right? You have to divide it into 5 phases so that you can look at it in a granular way and figure out where the mistakes are, and then how to fix those mistakes. But I think beyond that, an aiming point is a huge concept that a lot of people don't really spend enough time. Like, if the landing itself is built off of a good approach, then being able to control your airspeed while holding an aiming point is the number one skill you need to have for that approach. And yet still, when I fly with pilots, I'll say, what's your aiming point? And they'll be like, well, they'll either say, if it's a pilot I didn't train, they'll say, well, they're just unsure. What is an aiming point? Or I'm not exactly sure. And if it's students that I've been flying with, before we can actually land the airplane, I want to see them hold their airspeed, have an aiming point on the runway, which, for anybody that doesn't know, is there's always one reference in the window that's not moving. Like, as you point toward the ground, um, everything moves sort of outward from that one reference that isn't moving in your
Mm-hmm.
window. That's what the aircraft is pointed at. And that's not exactly where you're going to land, but that's an important reference in the landing. So being able to have that and sort of move it, I think before I actually get into the rest of the landing, I'll say to students something like, okay, let's aim for the numbers. Their speed's on target. The numbers are their aiming point. I can clearly see that they're able to hold that aiming point. And then somewhere on short final, maybe a mile out, I'll say, actually, let's move the aiming point to the 500-foot markers. Now, can they adjust the pitch and power such that we've now moved the aiming point to another place on the runway and still keep the speed where they want it? Tells me a lot. It's a, sort of pat your head, rub your tummy kind of moment. It tells me that they have
Mhm.
this relationship with pitch and power that will keep them safe and achieve that objective. And then, okay, now let's go into the rest of the landing next time around.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, understanding energy management, I mean, that's what flying's all about, right? Like understanding
Yeah.
how to carry airspeed, how much airspeed you need, adjusting for the energy needed for the airplane is just paramount. And kind
Yeah.
of feeling what the airplane is doing, what the airplane's telling you. That's another thing that's kind of difficult at first too, because then they're like, feel the airplane, feel the airplane. It's like, well, do you feel that you're uncoordinated at the turn? Do you feel your butt going this way and your back going
Yeah.
that way? And
Yeah.
those are things that are frustrating because everyone learns that at a different pace. Everyone learns at a different time. Like you're not just, some people can, but you're more than likely not going to get in the airplane, do steep turns, and feel that you're uncoordinated. You can visually see you're uncoordinated because the ball's all the way outside. So you can
Yeah.
use all the cues that you have going on to help you. But eventually it's going to get to the point where you're kind of like, wow, this plane doesn't feel trimmed out right. And you can change the trim just by feel. You can
Yeah.
feel you're slow. And eventually you get in when you're training a private pilot, you cover up the airspeed indicator, right?
Yep.
And you feel the airplane speed and you feel it. And I think that's just so important to figure out, but also understand it's going to take some time. You're not going to go up
Yeah.
there day one unless you're Jason Miller and figure that out.
And it wasn't me on day one. um,
They too.
yeah. And that actually brings us, sort of back full circle to something you were saying at the beginning, which was really clear in my mind a second ago. And now I just forgot. Um, what was that? Uh, Oh, you were talking about being ready? Oh, investing in yourself, right? Taking the
Mhm.
time, you made a comment early on, taking the time to invest in yourself might cost you a little bit more money in the beginning, but will help accelerate things downstream. And forgive me for one more analogy, but
We're
sailing is
getting
a
in
great
aviation.
example.
You got to get used to analogies, so it's all good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but if there's any sailors, they understand that sometimes you go the wrong direction to only go faster later, right? It's called tacking. So, like in a sailboat race, the wind is always coming from the same direction, but each skipper has a choice. Some skippers might go that way, some skippers might go that way. They're all trying to go upwind, but there's no way to go directly upwind. So they have different guesses, and some folks think maybe they get a lot of speed in the beginning and they'll have slow speed at the end, but they'll be closer. Other people think, hey, let's go slower in the beginning, but stay closer to where we want to be. And then at the end, we'll make up time. Right. So it's like that with flight training. If you make these investments early on, if you figure out the seat of your pants flying stuff, if you spend some time with the flight instruments covered, it's one of the reasons, like if you go through the flight videos in our app, some of the stuff is ACS related, like obviously all the maneuvers you have to do on the test, slow flight, stalls, steep turns. But some of the exercises we put in there are just exercises, just skill building exercises, stall exercises or coordination exercises or runway exercises, things that simply just build those muscles. And I think if folks take a little bit of time, like you said up front, they gain those skills. Everything after that goes
Mhm.
faster.
Absolutely. A lot of anxiety for a student pilot is the solo day. And for better or for worse, a lot of times instructors surprise their students for the solo. You go up, you do 3 touch and goes, and then you're like, hey, oh my gosh, my iPad, I need to charge it. I need to go back. And then you're like, hey, you just jump out. And you're like, good luck, three touch and goes, come back. I'll be watching. Don't mess it up.
Yeah, yeah.
As a student, there's no way getting around that. A solo is very anxious. It's an anxious time. You're always going to be doubting yourself. You're always going to think you're not ready. But talk about it from an instructor's point of view and a student's point of view about attacking that solo, and one, not putting too much pressure on it if it takes you 5 hours versus if it takes you 20 hours. Because at the end of the day, you just want to get your private pilot license and you're building that time and you're hopefully still improving. But talk a little bit from a student's mentality and an instructor's mentality.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm not that instructor, the one that you just mentioned. Like I would never surprise my students with a solo. I just it's doesn't feel right to me, like interpersonally. But I think it was done that way to
Yeah.
me, and it's super common, and it's so it's maybe a taste thing, like a style difference.
Hmm.
But I always say to my students, when you are ready to solo, we're both going to know it. So that's one important ingredient, that we both have to know it, and you have to want it, and I have to want it, right? So by the time my students are ready to solo, I kind of want them sort of like pushing me out of the plane. I would love to hear the week before the solo, I'm ready. Don't you think I'm ready? Like, you could probably get out next week, and then that gets me thinking about it.
Yeah.
Like, is this person ready? And one of my colleagues, I still can't do this, but one of my colleagues, Lisa, said that she'll actually sit on her hands to make sure that she'll sit on her hands for like a landing or a flight to know that her student's totally ready to go. But you should both feel that. There shouldn't be any, like, if the student doesn't feel that, there's no benefit to the instructor pushing
Hmm.
them out of the nest like some little baby bird. It's not good for anybody. It's like they could have a traumatic experience up there that causes them to never fly airplanes again. The
Hmm.
anxiety could be so intense that they just don't have an enjoyable experience, or even worse, maybe they truly aren't ready because you're the only one that thinks so, apparently. And
Hmm.
maybe there's an accident. Or God forbid there's an accident of some kind. They run off the runway and break the nose wheel or whatever, but they didn't feel ready. They felt pushed into it. So I
Yeah,
feel like it's a contract that we both have to sign, like no surprises. Unless we both have
absolutely.
already made that agreement and now it's just up to me to pop the cork on the bottle.
Yeah.
That could be a surprise, I guess. But yeah, in general, I'm not gonna do that.
What's funny is I feel like before you're solo, you always have some kind of mistake too, right? Like it's like whether it's the flight before, or the landing before your instructor gets out, I feel like you make a mistake and then you correct it, but you think that mistake is going to push you back and you're not going to do it, and you're not going to be able to solo. But in reality, that mistake and you realizing you made a mistake and correcting for that mistake in time is probably exactly what your instructor wants to see in the moment. Because if your instructor just sees good landing after good landing after good landing, there might be a little bit of hesitation because you haven't seen that adversity yet. And when you do your solo, I don't know why this happens. Every single time the pattern starts to fill up, Southwest decides to come to your airport. The weirdest things will happen on your solo.
Yeah. Yeah,
Tower
yeah,
shuts
yeah.
down. I don't know what it is, but something's going to be
Sure.
thrown at you. And I'd say not all the time, but I'd say 75% of the time, everyone has kind of an interesting solo experience of how just something out of the norm happened that threw you off and you had to account for that. And as an
Yeah.
instructor, I'm guessing you really want to see how they handle adversity before you get to the point of them doing it alone in the plane.
100%. No, I mean that's very intuitive. In fact, if I can't find the adversity, I'll create it. So,
Yeah.
like, I think I did a YouTube video, if anyone wants to look at it, called either Precision Lateral Control or Side Slips with Paul. I can't remember what it's called, but anyway, I had this student Paul. We made a YouTube video about it. But like, I will literally take the airplane in the flare. If I think my students are ready, I will take the airplane right in the flare and I'll say my aircraft, and I'll just balloon up 100 feet and say your aircraft. Now they're 60 feet and 100 feet over the runway. Like, I need
Mhm.
to see them manage the airspeed and get back down. Or the next time around, I'll say, I want you to line up with the right edge of the runway, the very edge of the runway. So, like, if we were to touch down, we'd be taking out runway lights. And then in the flare, I want them to pull the power to idle, start the flare, and now side slip over to the center line, stop the drift, and land that airplane on the center line. Like, can they
Mhm.
control it laterally? Once I see those two things, I have no problem. I mean, I know you're going to be
Yeah.
fine. You're fine through the private pilot now. I mean, that tells me that we have successfully connected the pitch and power, the airspeed control stuff you were talking about, right? They've those connections are there, and they're as good as
Yeah.
anybody. So
And I think another important kind of mindset to have is never be afraid to go around. I think a lot of times when you are flying a 172, you might have like a 3,000, 4,000, maybe a 5,000 foot runway, and you just think like small plane stops fast, I'll be fine. Yeah, that's true for 172, but you're going to start flying bigger planes. You're going to start flying faster airplanes. You're going to start flying Moonies who are very speed conscious, and you need to be on a certain speed and
yeah,
understanding when things aren't going how you want them to go and just get out of there. Just go around.
yep,
I think that's going to be something that's going to save your life eventually and really make you the best pilot possible. And then if you err on going around more times than not, that's so you cost yourself a little bit more money, but just for the fact that you see and understand that being safe is important, that's gonna be great for your airline career or just your professional pilot career or just buying a 182 and flying it around.
yeah, 100%. And this will sort of tie in some concepts too, but that's kind of what I meant earlier too when we were talking about standard operating procedures, is like, because what you said
Hmm.
is absolutely true, 100%. Be ready to go around. And so what I'd like to see pilots do is even take that to the next level and say, okay, as I arrive at an airport, I have a standard arrival flow. We, in our app, we teach the 5 A's: ATIS, altimeter,
Hmm.
approach, briefing, avionics, and airplane. And in that approach briefing, you should review the length of the runway, and you should pick an abort point. If my wheels aren't down by this point, it's an automatic go around. This should be part of your standard operating procedure as you arrive at an airport, for you to sort of brief what the arrival's like, make sure you have all the weather, make sure your altimeter is set properly. And instead of remembering all this stuff, you just build in
Hmm.
some standardization. And so if there's anything, like you said, on short final, a gust of wind, or any reason go around, but you also have in the back of your mind that if my wheels aren't down by a certain point, I'm going to go around. And sometimes we don't have to understand why. Like some of the SOPs that Richard taught me were built in the early 1900s, and I may not know why. But just to follow it through for anyone listening to this, you mentioned a Mooney or a faster airplane. Well, a Mooney has a laminar flow air wing, very low to the ground. There are very many Mooney accidents on the books that are late go arounds. So maybe you
Hmm.
learn to pick that abort point, not so much for the 152 you're learning to fly in, but rather so that the law of primacy says that when you do upgrade to the Mooney, it is part of the way you
Yep.
learned it. It's the way you do it.
Exactly.
You just pick your point, and that's the way you fly.
Yep.
Um, and I guess the last thought too on that is something that I wanted to say to private pilots on this recording. So I'm glad it came up. But all of this goes with you. I don't know why it's important to say that, but I just like, I feel it is. A lot of people train to the airplane that they're learning, right? If it's a low wing airplane, they have great fuel management. If it's, if the airplane is a Citabria and it has no heading indicator, they have no idea that you're supposed to connect a magnetic compass to a heading indicator. They've never heard that. They fly a Citabria. But
Yeah.
you're the pilot. Like, we're training you in this sample platform. And as you go through your flying career and learn other things, just you be cautious not to sort of dumb yourself down to whatever plane you're flying. So
Hmm.
this morning I have a lesson in a Cessna 172 with a G1000. Tomorrow I'm flying a standard panel airplane. Next week I'm flying a multi-engine airplane. As much as possible, I want to keep the procedures I use standard to myself and not have it vary depending on what kind of machine I'm in.
Yeah, for sure. I got to get ready to go here soon, but we might need to do a part two because I feel like there's just so much information for private pilot. It's so important. But
Yeah.
quickly, we'll brief on check rides. I think, and I thought that the private pilot check ride was one of my toughest ones just
Mm,
because I didn't know what to expect.
yeah.
I watched YouTube videos. I think there's even like a really, really old, I feel like it's got to be like the first within the first 5 YouTube videos ever made with like who was making it about how you probably have seen it. The
Oh
two
yeah.
guys that are doing the oral and they're just asking questions just to get a vibe of what an oral sounded like, felt like. I feel like I memorized all those answers and questions as well.
Yeah, dude, it's
But
funny. I knew that guy, Alan Engelhart. Yeah, he's a United
really?
Yeah, yeah. He was a DP in Chicago. I mean, I don't know who filmed that,
Oh,
but when
no
I was
way.
getting my
Yeah.
private, yeah, I could have gone with Al.
That's funny. I
Isn't that funny?
should have hit him up if he's still alive because it was so old.
Yeah, he's got to be old now, man. I don't know. He was in
Yeah.
his, yeah, I don't think he's still alive, but
People have probably seen it, it's still up there. But
yeah.
talk about nerves, check ride, being ready, and just what to expect.
Um, I think all the way through this, when I said that my students have to be ready for solo and my students have to be ready for check ride, I think you can and should feel confident. So just so people know, if you're being pushed into a solo or being pushed into a check ride and you don't know if you're ready or not, it's not the right time. Okay. And
Right.
maybe there's more rigorous preparation that you could do. But of course, folks are going to be nervous going into the check ride. I think the biggest thing for me is obviously that there are demonstration skills, like interpersonal skills. And I can
Hmm.
proudly say, by the way, and I'm very proud to say this, but I've never failed a check ride. So all the way from private up through
Nice.
ATP, and it's not a big deal to fail a check ride. But the reason that I say that as a badge of honor or whatever, I don't think it's. I think it's, first of all, almost entirely due to my mentor Richard, who kind of made me the pilot that I am. I think a lot of that standardization that I've described and a lot of the ways that we teach pilots to talk out loud and do these flow checks and back it up with
Mhm.
checklists is very impressive to examiners, just in terms of your preparedness. You show up like that to a check ride and they can clearly see that you've got tight procedures that remind them of a professional world, and they can see that that's the way you've been trained. Some calmness just went into their mind. Like they think, okay, this person has good training. So I credit Richard with that. But the reason I mentioned I've never failed a check ride is because I don't think it's so much about my flying skills as it is about interpersonal relations. So people shouldn't forget, in a check ride, you have to convince a person. Like that's at the end of the
Mhm.
day. And this person has a very difficult job. This person has to figure out somewhere between 4 and 6 hours if you are going to be a safe pilot or a danger, right? And it's a very tricky thing to figure out. Did you fulfill the requirements of the ACS? You know, are you ready for this certificate? And so there are strategies, and I think some of those strategies are built into training. For example, we talked about the athletics analogy. I think this goes
Mhm.
right into check ride preparedness. Like in athletics, you have the idea of a scrimmage, right? So I don't really know much about football, but I'm imagining that some days you break off into special teams and the offense is doing their thing, defense is doing their thing, and whatever.
Yeah.
Everybody's broken up into their own little units, doing specialized drills and training, whatever. And then you come back the next week and you put it all together and there's like shirts and skins or whatever, whatever you guys
Yep.
do in football,
Yeah.
red and white.
Pretty close.
And yeah, and you play a game to see if all that stuff worked, right?
Yeah.
And flying is the same way. So if throughout training you've taken scrimmage days and called those what I call demonstration days. So I'll take my students out and I'll say, today's a skill building day. We're just building skills. We're going to teach you how to stall and fly and do all the things or whatever. Next Wednesday, it's a demonstration day. So I'm just going to sit there and I'm going to play examiner, and I want you to demonstrate what you know to me, because demonstration itself is a skill. Like, how do I do the demonstration? I do a clearing turn first, and then I do a flow check, and then I do the maneuver,
Mhm.
then I do a flow check, then I look at you and say, what's next, sir? You know, like there's a way I want you to show up. And same with the oral. And you know, I feel like you know, always talking about our app, but in our app, we've created what we call the mock oral simulator. You know, I don't think there's anything like
Yeah.
it, but it's a video simulator for an oral tied entirely to the ACS. And I think going into a check ride, if you've studied the ACS, you can't fail the oral. Like if you've gone through the ACS and you know that you can talk about every code right up to the flight,
Mhm.
I mean, literally, you can't fail the oral. The examiner is
Yeah.
restricted to evaluating those codes and obliged to test every code. So if you just study the
Yep.
codes and can handle yourself, you're going to pass the oral.
Exactly. And I think it's important too, if you don't know a question, the answer is not no. It's like, let's look it up, right? You're not expected to know everything. They're going to ask you questions that, even if you don't know, aren't going to be failure items. A lot of times they're just there to push your knowledge. They honestly want to see how much you know. And sometimes they might even lead it off with like, this isn't like a Jeopardy question or anything, but what do you know about this? What do you know about this? Or how does this work with that? And those are not questions, like I said, to necessarily fail you. It's just either they want to know how much you know, or sometimes they want to prove to you that they know more than you, which
Right.
honestly does happen in check
Yeah,
rides.
yeah. It's just be really careful with the look it up strategy. I've seen that
Yeah.
backfire more times than
Oh,
I've seen
really?
it work. Yeah. I mean, so to keep in
Yeah.
mind that like everything that you just said is true. So for a listener, you
Yeah.
absolutely can look it up, but this is where it can go south. And I've seen it in stuff like this where the examiner will say, we're going out on a flight today. It's a dual instruction flight, and the landing light is burned
Yeah.
out when we get to the airplane. Can we go? Now, that's a bit of a trick question, because that, you know, it says that if the operation is for hire, you need a landing light. But what the examiner is really asking is, what does it mean to be a for hire operation? Does flight training qualify? So I could hand you a book of regs and say, go ahead and look that up.
Mhm.
But we're going to sit there for the next 20 minutes while you slowly realize the depth of the question that I've asked. And now you're like, wait a minute, is that 91205 or is that part one
Yeah.
definitions? Now we have to look up what is it for hire. And as you sit there and struggle to find the thing that you're talking about, is just silence in the room. The examiner is getting
Yep.
uncomfortable. Everybody's getting uncomfortable. So the examiner will say, all right, listen, I'm going to go get a cup of coffee. I'll be right back. We'll talk about it when we get back. But you can't find anything in the 5 minutes they're gone. You know, it can go south pretty fast. If
Yeah.
here's a way it could work. Maybe something more specific, like, oh gosh, wow, I was back to equipment list. But if it's an arbitrary list of things, and you say to yourself, like the regulation 91205 is all the equipment that you need. That's the one that I actually just referenced. But
Yeah.
if you say to the examiner, look, it's tomatoes aflame is what I use to remember this, and it's tachometer, oil pressure. So I can't remember the other one, but I know it's 91205. Let me just look really quick, you know. Okay,
Yeah.
91205. Oh, I got it. Tachometer, you know. That it can work
Yeah.
like that, but it's
Yep.
a 50-50 shot. It can go south also.
Yeah. I agree. Well, hey, those are all the questions I have for you now. I can hear my kids screaming, so I got to go. So
All right, man.
we'll
I'm
either do a
sorry.
part 2 later or just move on to instrument. No, you're good. It's not your fault at all. Or we'll move on to an instrument. So we'll go from that. But congratulations on either becoming a private pilot or learning to become a private pilot. It's a great, if you just stop at private, it's great, but recommend you go to instrument. So check out the next video as well. Jason,
Awesome.
appreciate it. Thank you. See you
Thanks,
later.
Justin. All right, see ya.